There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. The knife had a handle of polished black bone, and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to that house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I will be discussing the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, which I just read the opening line to, and what an awesome opening line. Had me interested right away, so definitely was excited to talk about this book. So this, I will note, I actually got without even realizing it is at least a partially illustrated edition, including the illustration for what I just read, which starts like this, where you just have the knife, and then breaks into some other pages here. This book is not illustrated throughout, but there are a lot of passages where you'll get kind of the text and with the illustrations, which sometimes I really enjoyed them and they added something, other times not as much, but it was interesting. I've not read a lot of books with illustrations, and I've done a few now, so I found it kind of does add an element to the story. So let's talk though about what the Graveyard Book is. The Graveyard Book, from what Gaiman has said, and in like the notes in the back, is at least partially based, or not really based, but inspired by The Jungle Book, which I have not read. But apparently this was kind of like part of the base idea was like The Jungle Book, but instead of a baby being raised in the jungle, it's a baby being raised in a graveyard. Now you can probably tell from the start here, it does start pretty dark with a family being murdered, but their baby, who's a toddler at the time, basically getting away and ending up in a graveyard where the denizens of the graveyard decide that they will protect him and raise him so that he will be safe. And so that's kind of the inciting incident here. So we end up with Nobody Owens taking the name of his ghostly mother and father. Nobody, which is a reference to, he's kind of commented that he's nobody. And a man called Jack, who is the one who was trying to murder him along with the rest of his family. So it starts out a bit dark, but this does feel like it's a book that's more so aimed at younger readers. And with Gaiman, he does like to draw the line. So with his books, it often feels like it may be something that's more like appropriate for younger readers, while at the same time adults can get something out of it. Ocean at the End of the Lane was another book that was quite dark, but a lot of it was something that you as an adult would read, but if a child was reading it, probably wouldn't quite get what was going on with the way that it was done. So he has that kind of odd quality to his books, and I know he does it intentionally. It's something he tries to do, is make it so that everybody can get something out of it, and that the books really are more all ages, versus just being for adults or just being for kids. He, for the most part, seems to do that very well. And this is a very Gaiman-y Gaiman book as well, which is really the best way I know how to say it. If you've read any Neil Gaiman, you know he has a very distinct style that's just kind of odd and just makes his books feel like they were written by him. You don't typically open up to a Neil Gaiman book and think it like, oh, this sounds like this author. A lot of it is very, very just his style, which is like I said, is pretty distinct. So it's kind of hard to describe. But as I read like the opening line, it's something about it just kind of works for me. So I've read, at this point, I've read American Gods and Ocean at the End of the Lane and Stardust are the ones I've read. I still haven't read Neverwhere. I have Neverwhere, and I probably should have read that before this because I just recently got this. But I decided to read this one because this is one I've specifically heard as a really good one, and I did really enjoy this book. So this was a very odd setup, and it takes place over, all told, probably around 13, 14 years is the time frame that this takes place. We jump in time usually a couple of years at a time as Nobody Owens is growing up, and it's his experiences in the graveyard, meeting all of these different people, having all kinds of adventures there, and also some of his interactions with the world outside, along with all kinds of interesting denizens. We have, for one, Silas, who agrees to be his guardian, and Silas is left extremely mysterious. You can kind of figure some things out about it as you go on, and then it's fully kind of revealed what his deal is later on, which is done in a pretty slow reveal way. and he agrees to be the guardian because, unlike the ghostly denizens of the graveyard, he can leave the graveyard and actually basically exist outside of the graveyard in a physical form. And we really get a lot of interesting pieces because there's a lot that's established with the graveyard and what they're allowed to do. And Nobody Owens, who goes by Bod, he is kind of like halfway between. He is still alive and he is still, a living human. But because of basically like him living there, he also is able to do some of the things that ghosts can do. So we get this interesting path taking him, seeing him, and his interactions. And really, this just there's definitely a plot, and it's hard to describe because I really enjoyed this book. It's one of those books where it didn't really matter so much what was happening. Like, you do have a lot of parts where there's not a ton going on, but it was still enjoyable. But just really exploring it. And you get, as well, just seeing all these different people from different time periods reacting. There's a lot of bits in here that are, I imagine, from some mythology or another. Some of it I was not familiar with. But Gaiman does a great job of weaving in both things that we would know from the real world, or like actual like people like buried in this graveyard, include such people as like there's a president, there's some other important people. At one point we see actually it's not buried in the graveyard, but I don't know how I want to say it, but there are references to just different notable figures, including a president of the United States, the Emperor of China, at one point some other things, and there's some very definitive cultures and real world places that are referenced, as well as all kinds of different mythological creatures that are brought up in there as well, and we get to see interacting with Bod as he goes out throughout his life. And so we get a lot of that in, and a lot of mythos that's just really interesting to read. And you get all of this through his eyes as he's just growing up in a graveyard like it's normal. And also some really interesting scenes, like I said, with the outside world and that going on. Of course, though, the big thing is this: as he grows up and kind of understands more about what happened, that his family was murdered, and that somebody does want to kill him, and that the graveyard's basically trying to keep him safe, he has to come to some decisions about what he's going to do as he starts to get older. So that's a lot about it. We do get we don't spend a ton of time with the different ghosts of the characters, but each one of them definitely has a personality. A lot of this is just him going through, and he meets different people, sees the gravestones. We get all kinds of little comments from the epitaphs on the graveyard, for one, and where he's reading them and like seeing what they say. All these references to different time periods, different people, and it just weaves a very satisfying story, I guess is the way that I'll say it. It works out really, really well, and I found it to be quite enjoyable. We do, of course, because it's Neil Gaiman, he starts to introduce some more overarching things that weren't entirely clear for the most part toward the end. There were a few things that seemed like they could have probably used a little bit more time to develop. And that's where where Stardust felt like a lot of stuff was rushed. I didn't really care for that one at all, for other reasons as well. I didn't necessarily feel like this here. It kind of worked for the ending, but I did feel like some of the elements that were introduced toward the ending and were kind of only talked about there, as well as kind of the, I'll tell you everything because it's not going to matter type trope, which was in there a little bit, which was a fairly clumsy way to really reveal more about some of the things that I'm talking about. But we get some stuff like that at the end that really could have been developed more, but it didn't bother me so much because it was still, like I said, it was still a good ending. And the way the book does completely end, I thought worked really well. And it kind of seemed like you could tell that's where things were going to end up. There were some allusions to it throughout and some references, but it was interesting the way it looked. This book also uses the self-fulfilling prophecy trope to an extent, which is not something I'm a huge fan of. It can be done very well, but it's just something that's been seen a lot. And once again, I felt like it was, I don't know, it wasn't the super dissatisfying, but it wasn't the most satisfying. And I feel like it's because Gaiman was trying to give this overall, like the plot that started it, have it come back around at the end and have a conclusion, and it worked to an extent, but I feel like the middle parts that were the most enjoyable where things were a little bit different. And they're just, like I said, there wasn't a ton of explanation really about some of the events and some of the different characters. And the man named Jack as well. So I feel like more could have been done there, but really he was keeping it, I think, more of a simple story, because once again, this is supposed to be something that kind of works for all ages. So that's where I think it suffers. A little bit more depth there would have worked, but overall this did really work for me. This was a good story. So this definitely goes in the hit category for Gaiman and me. I had mentioned he was a bit hit and miss because I really liked American Gods. I loved Ocean at the End of the Lane, but I really did not care for Stardust. And so I was still excited to read more Gaiman. And this is one, like I said, I'd heard a lot about. So this was an enjoyable book. Very quick read, even with the illustrations that take up some page count. This is a little under 300 pages. Text is pretty normal size, so this is not something that'll take you very long to read. I think if you like Gaiman and you have not read this, absolutely read it, because it's definitely a good book, especially if you like Neil Gaiman. This could be something interesting, though, just to introduce you to his style as well, even if you haven't. So if you've not read Gaiman, I think this would be a fine book to start with, mostly because I feel like American Gods, and I still enjoyed it, but I feel like it would have been better had I been more familiar with his style already, because I could appreciate it, and that's the first book that kind of showed me the way that he writes. Reading one of his other shorter books, though, I feel like might help for somebody, or like if you tried American Gods and it was just odd and you couldn't get into it, maybe try one of his other books like this one, or Ocean at the End of the Lane, that are quick. That one's really short, and just kind of see if it works for you, because it's a good quick read and enjoyable, and it takes some familiar things, like I said, but it explores them in a very different way. And just kind of having the backdrop of the graveyard, I think, really worked out to see a lot of different exploration with this character, and I think Gaiman did a good job with it. He did specifically say, like I said, that the Jungle Book was some of the inspiration. Like I said, I also said, I have not read the Jungle Book books, and it's based off the books, not the movie, I should note. But I haven't read that, so I can't completely comment on that. But I think it makes sense with just knowing what the base plot of that is, but with a very different backdrop of the graveyard. And another interesting note, he said specifically, too, that part of it that inspired him to it was watching his 3-year-old son, who was on a tricycle when they were somewhere near a graveyard, I guess, near headstones. Just seeing him not thinking anything of it, just like it was just the background. And so that kind of look of, normally graveyards are thought to be kind of like a creepy place. And the graveyard in this book is definitely described to be extremely creepy in a lot of ways. But when you're somebody who literally has lived there your whole life, it doesn't seem that way. So it's just an interesting look at that as well, where that was Bod's home. That was normal. It was the outside world that was weird. And so it does a good job of just kind of looking at that juxtaposition in some interesting ways. But really, those were my thoughts on The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Let me know your thoughts if you have read this or if you're wanting to read it. This, like I said, was a really interesting book, and usually people's opinions are pretty broad on Neil Gaiman, so I'm always super interested to hear, especially on this, where he can be a little bit more divisive as an author with people liking or not liking. Really interested to hear what people think about this one, so definitely let me know in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Also check the link in the description for the Wizardly Duo Discord if you want to chat this book, any books, anything else really. We're always having a ton of fun, and we would love to have you. And of course, if you'd like to see more of my content, make sure to subscribe.